On a frigid winter night in Queens, New York, Emily Harper, an exhausted waitress, spots a secret in a stranger's wallet, a photo of her mom, radiant and laughing beside a powerful man. When she asks, "Do you know my mom?" he panics, drops a $50 bill, and vanishes into the blizzard. Who is he? Why has he carried her mom's picture for 24 years? A tale of broken families, betrayal, and courage unfolds. But the ending might surprise you. Stick around to uncover the truth behind that photo. If you're curious, hit like, subscribe, and comment your guess. Who's Daniel Carver to Emily? Let's see if you can crack it before the reveal. The wind screamed through the hollowed-out streets of Queens, New York, and clawing at the rusted edges of Dee's Diner's sign as it swayed precariously above the door. Snowflakes pelted the smudged windows, streaking trails of frost across the glass like tears frozen mid-fall. Inside, the air hung thick with the acrid tang of burnt coffee and the ghosts of grease-soaked meals, the fluorescent lights flickering with a sickly buzz that grated on the nerves. It was December 2012, a night so cold it sank into your bones, and behind the counter stood Emily Harper, her calloused hands wiping down the chipped formica with a rag that had long lost its fight. At 24, she wasn't the kind of girl who wore her hardship like a badge. Her hazel eyes, sharp and shadowed, carried the weight of too many sleepless nights, her dark hair yanked back into a messy bun that frayed at the edges. Her apron, stained with the day's spills, clung to her like a second skin, a uniform of survival in a world that offered her no quarter. Emily didn't smile through the grind. She didn't have the energy. 14-hour shifts at Dee's were her lifeline, the only thing keeping the oxygen tank humming in her mom's bedroom, the only shield against the avalanche of medical bills that piled up like a cruel joke. Grace Harper was all she had left, a fragile thread of love in a tapestry of loss, and Emily would claw through hell itself to keep her breathing. She glanced at the clock, 10:03 p.m. The diner was a graveyard save for the static hiss of an old radio spitting out weather warnings and the occasional clatter of a spoon against a cracked mug. Her shoulders slumped, her fingers rubbing at the ache in her temples, when the bell above the door jangled, a shrill, unexpected note that snapped her upright. She expected another regular, a grizzled trucker, or a night shift straggler. But the man who stepped through the threshold didn't fit the mold. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his thick overcoat swallowing most of his frame. But the gleam of polished leather shoes and the deep, commanding timbre of his voice hit her like a jolt. "Black coffee," he said, sliding into the corner booth where the shadows pooled thickest, his face half hidden beneath the brim of his hood. Emily's gut twisted. He didn't belong here. Not in Queens, not in Dee's, where the clientele wore their struggles in the lines of their faces and the slump of their spines. She grabbed a chipped mug from the stack, her fingers brushing the rough edges, and poured the coffee, the steam curling upward like a wisp of smoke in the dim light. She carried it over, her boots scuffing the worn linoleum, and set it down with a curt, $2. He didn't look up, his gaze fixed on the swirling snow beyond the window, a distant storm brewing in his silence. "Keep it hot," he muttered, reaching into his coat for a wallet. Old, leather, its edges softened by years of use. As he flipped it open, a faded Polaroid slipped into view, catching the faint glow of the overhead light. Emily froze, her breath snagging in her chest. The woman in the photo was unmistakable. Her mom, Grace, younger than Emily had ever known her, auburn hair spilling over her shoulders, her smile wide and unguarded, radiating a joy that time and sickness had stolen away. Beside her stood a man, dark hair, sharp jaw, a younger version of the stranger before her, his arms slung casually around Grace's waist. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a frantic rhythm that drowned out the radio's drone. She leaned closer, the mug trembling in her hand, her voice escaping before she could cage it. "Excuse me, sir," she said, the words sharp, unsteady, cutting through the stillness. "Why do you have that picture in your wallet? Do you know my mom?" The question hung there, raw and reckless, a spark tossed into dry tinder. The man's hands stilled, his fingers hovering over the wallet as if it might burn him. His head snapped up, and for the first time she saw his eyes, piercing blue, framed by silver-streaked hair, flickering with a storm of emotions she couldn't untangle. Panic flashed across his face, quick and unguarded, his gaze darting from her to the photo, Grace's smile staring back at him like an accusation from the past. For a heartbeat, his lips parted, as if a truth long buried clawed its way to the surface. She saw it, the tremor in his jaw, the way his breath hitched, a man caught off guard by a ghost he couldn't outrun. But then the mask slammed down, his features hardening into something cold, impenetrable. He snapped the wallet shut with a sharp click, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the quiet diner. "An old acquaintance," he said, his voice flat, final, though it wavered just enough to betray the lie beneath. He tossed a crisp $50 bill onto the table, absurd for a $2 coffee, and stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with a screech that set her teeth on edge. "Keep the change," he muttered, his tone clipped as he brushed past her, his coat sweeping the air like a shadow fleeing the light. The bell clanged as he pushed through the door, disappearing into the blizzard, his silhouette swallowed by the swirling white. Emily stood rooted, her hands trembling, the mug still clutched in her grip as the heat seeped into her skin. $50? For coffee? Her mind raced, stitching together fragments that didn't fit. "An old acquaintance," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. She'd seen the flinch in his eyes, the crack in his armor. He knew Grace, knew her mom in a way that went beyond passing glances. She set the mug down, her fingers fumbling as she snatched the $50 from the table, shoving it into her apron pocket. Her gaze darted to the booth, landing on a crumpled newspaper someone had left behind. The kind of cheap tabloid that littered the diner's corners. She grabbed it, smoothing it out, and her breath caught as the front page stared back at her. Daniel Carver, CEO of Carver Tech, faces internal crisis. The photo was unmistakable. Silver-streaked hair, piercing blue eyes, the same man who'd just walked out. A billionaire, in Dee's diner, with her mom's picture tucked in his wallet like a secret he couldn't let go. "What the hell?" she hissed, her voice shaking as the pieces collided in her head. Her chest tightened, a mix of dread and fury igniting beneath her ribs. She yanked off her apron, tossing it onto the counter, and grabbed her coat from the hook by the door. The diner could wait. Grace couldn't. She needed answers, and she needed them now. The bell jangled as she pushed into the night, the snow swallowing her footsteps as she ran toward home. Daniel Carver's face, and that fleeting, haunted look in his eyes, etched into her mind like a brand. Emily's boots pounded the icy pavement as she tore through the snow-choked streets of Queens, the wind clawing at her face with frozen fingers. Her breath burst out in jagged clouds, dissolving into the blizzard that swallowed the faint glow of Dee's diner behind her. The $50 bill Daniel Carver had flung onto the table burned in her apron pocket, a mocking ember of a mystery she couldn't shake. Her mind spun, replaying the moment, that Polaroid slipping from his wallet. Grace, her mom, young and radiant, laughing beside a man who just sat in her booth, his blue eyes flickering with something dark, haunted. "An old acquaintance," he'd said, his voice wavering before he bolted into the night. Bullshit. She'd seen the crack in his mask, the tremor in his hand. He wasn't some stranger passing through. He knew Grace, and the weight of that truth drove her forward, her legs pumping against the cold until her lungs burned. The apartment building loomed ahead, a sagging beast of cracked brick and shattered dreams, its windows patched with duct tape, its stairwell reeking of mildew and despair. Emily fumbled with her keys, her fingers numb and clumsy, the lock grinding as she shoved the door open. Inside, the air was heavy, stale with the scent of unwashed dishes and the faint metallic tang of Grace's oxygen tank, a sound as familiar as her own heartbeat, a lifeline threading through the silence. The living room was a battlefield of survival, a couch sagging under threadbare blankets, a countertop buried beneath a fortress of unpaid bills, hospital invoices, rent notices, threats in red ink, and a single bulb flickering overhead like a dying star. She kicked off her boots, the thud echoing through the cramped space, and crossed to the corner where a battered shoebox lay hidden beneath a pile of thrift store sweaters. Grace's keepsakes, a reliquary of a past Emily had only glimpsed in fragments. Her hands shook as she pried off the lid, the cardboard groaning under her grip. Inside, a jumble of relics spilled out. Yellowed letters tied with twine, a tarnished locket that no longer clasped, a scattering of Polaroids faded to sepia at the edges. She rifled through them, her breath hitching as her fingers closed around the match to Daniel's photo. Grace, her auburn hair cascading over her shoulders, her smile wide and unguarded, a light in her eyes that sickness had long since dimmed. Beside her stood a younger Daniel Carver, his dark hair tousled, his arms slung around her waist with a casual ease, a grin tugging at his lips. Behind them, a glass building gleamed under a sun that felt impossibly distant, the faint outline of Carver Tech etched into its surface like a prophecy. Emily's stomach lurched, a sickening tide of recognition washing over her. This wasn't chance. It was a tether, a thread binding her mom to the man who just walked out of her diner. She clutched the Polaroid, her knuckles whitening, and grabbed the crumpled newspaper from her coat. Daniel Carver, CEO of Carver Tech, faces internal crisis. The face staring back matched the man in the booth. Silver-streaked hair, piercing blue eyes, a billionaire cloaked in shadows. Her chest tightened, fury and dread coiling like snakes beneath her ribs. She stormed into the bedroom, her boots leaving faint smears of melted snow on the warped floorboards. Grace lay propped against a nest of pillows, her frail frame swallowed by a patched quilt, her gray hair fanning out like a shroud over the faded fabric. The oxygen tank hummed beside her, its mask dangling loose around her neck, her shallow breasts fogging the plastic in faint, uneven bursts. Emily flicked on the bedside lamp, the weak light spilling across her mom's sunken cheeks, casting harsh shadows that deepened the lines illness had carved into her face. "Mom, wake up," Emily said, her voice sharp, urgent, slicing through the stillness like a blade through silk. Grace's eyelids fluttered open, confusion clouding her hazel eyes Emily had inherited, though hers blazed with a fire Grace's had lost to years of quiet surrender. "Emily?" Grace rasped, her voice thin and scratchy, threaded with a mother's instinctive worry. "What's wrong, sweetie? You're trembling." Her hand reached out, frail but steady, brushing against Emily's arm as if to anchor her. Emily didn't flinch. She thrust the Polaroid forward, her hands shaking with a fury she could barely contain. "Daniel Carver was at the diner tonight," she said, the words tumbling out fast and hard, each one a hammer strike. "He had this picture, you and him, in his wallet. I asked if he knew you and he said, 'An old acquaintance,' before running out like I'd lit a fuse under him." She slapped the newspaper down beside the photo, Daniel's black and white image staring up like a judge from the past. "He's a billionaire, Mom. CEO of Carver Tech. Who the hell is he to you? Tell me the truth. Now!" The room seemed to hold its breath, the oxygen tank's hum swelling into a deafening roar as Grace's gaze fell on the Polaroid. Her face crumpled, her eyes widening in a storm of shock and recognition, her breath catching so hard the mask rattled against her chest. She was breaking, not just her body, but the fragile wall she'd built around a name she'd buried for decades. Her frail hands clutched the blanket, fingers digging into the fabric until her knuckles gleamed white, and for a moment she just stared, lost in a tide of memory that surged up to drown her. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice fracturing, a single tear tracing a slow, glistening path down her cheek. She turned her face away as if the photo could wound her anew, but Emily leaned closer, her shadow looming over the bed. "Mom, look at me," she snapped, her voice a whip crack in the silence. "Talk to me." Grace's trembling hand reached for Emily's, gripping it with a desperate strength that belied her fragile shell. "He's your father, Emily," she said, her voice raw, aching, heavy with a sadness so vast it seemed to swallow the room whole. "I loved him, more than I've ever loved anyone. We were young, broke, dreaming big together, him with his tech ideas, me stitching dresses to pay the rent. When I got pregnant with you, he got an offer. Silicon Valley, the start of Carver Tech. I begged him to stay, told him about you, but he said he'd come back once he made it. He never did." Tears streamed down her face now, her words choking out between sobs that shook her thin frame. "I tried calling, writing. Nothing got through. When you were 3, I saw him on TV, some tech conference, all suits and smiles. I almost called again. But then a man phoned me, cold, threatening, said I'd ruin Daniel if I didn't disappear. I was scared, Emily. For you, for us. I ran, cut every tie. I thought he'd forgotten me, built a life without us. But he kept that picture? After all these years? Emily's knees buckled, and she sank onto the edge of the bed, the Polaroid slipping from her fingers to flutter onto the quilt. My father? She choked out, her voice splintering under the weight of the word, a truth too heavy to hold. You're telling me that bastard's my dad? He's drowning in money while we're drowning in debt? While you're dying in this hellhole because of him? And you never told me? Grace's eyes fluttered shut, tears glistening on her lashes like dew on broken glass. I didn't want you to hate him, she murmured, her voice barely a whisper above the tank's hum. I didn't want you chasing a man who'd already walked away, or worse, getting hurt trying to find him. I thought I was keeping you safe. Safe, Emily shot back, her voice rising, sharp and jagged as shattered ice. He's got your picture in his wallet, Mom. He hasn't forgotten you. He just didn't care enough to look for us. She stood, pacing the cramped room, her boots thudding against the floorboards like a war drum echoing her rage. Her mind raced, stitching together the fragments. The $50 tossed like crumbs, the flinch in his eyes when she'd asked, the newspaper painting him as a titan of industry. Daniel Carver, she muttered, the name a curse on her tongue. She stopped, turning to Grace, her jaw set like steel forged in fire. He's got billions, Mom, hospitals, doctors, a life for you. He could have saved us. Instead, we've got this. Nothing. I'm not letting him walk away again. Grace reached out, her hand trembling in the air, her voice a desperate plea. Emily, don't, she said, her words cracking with fear. You don't know what he's become, what he's capable of now. That man on the phone? What if he's still out there? But Emily was already pulling on her coat, her movements jerky, fueled by a fury that had simmered her whole life, now boiling over. He owes us, she said, her voice low, lethal, a promise carved in stone. He owes you a chance to live, and me a goddamn explanation. I'm finding him, Mom, whether you like it or not. Across the city, Daniel Carver slumped in the leather seat of his sleek black SUV, the hum of the engine a dull roar beneath the chaos in his skull. The tinted windows blurred the neon sprawl of Manhattan, but he barely saw it. His fingers hovered over the wallet in his lap, its worn leather, a map of years he couldn't reclaim. He hadn't meant to stop at Dee's diner. He'd been driving aimlessly, fleeing the suffocating weight of boardroom threats and legal ultimatums, when some buried instinct dragged him back to Queens, to that grease-stained echo of his past. And then she happened, the waitress with Grace's hazel eyes, her voice slicing through 24 years of silence, like a blade through flesh. Do you know my mom? She'd asked, and for a heartbeat, he teetered on the edge, nearly spilled it all. Yes, I loved her. I left her. I've never stopped carrying her with me. But the words died in his throat, choked by the empire he'd built on the ashes of that love. The empire now teetering under the vultures circling above. He flipped open the wallet, the Polaroid staring back at him. Grace, her laughter frozen in time, her auburn hair catching the sunlight. Him beside her, a cocky kid with dreams too big for the world they'd shared. An old acquaintance, he muttered, the lie tasting bitter, souring the whiskey he'd downed earlier. His chest tightened, a dull ache spreading like wildfire through his ribs. What if that girl's mine? What if Grace is still out there, somewhere in this city? He could find them, send doctors, lawyers, money to mend the wreckage he'd left behind. The thought flickered, warm and treacherous, an ember of hope he hadn't felt in decades. But then his phone buzzed, shattering it, his assistant's voice barking through the speaker. Sir, the board's digging deeper. They've got whispers of your past. We need you here. Whispers. Scandal. Grace. If he claimed them now, Carver Tech would crumble, and he'd be nothing. A king stripped of his crown. He snapped the wallet shut, his knuckles white, the photo's edges pressing into his palm like a blade. Drive, he ordered, his voice hollow, echoing in the cavern of the SUV. The vehicle lurched forward, speeding into the night, but those hazel eyes clung to him. Grace's eyes mirrored in the girl who'd dared to ask. A ghost he couldn't bury, a reckoning he couldn't outrun. Back in the apartment, Emily stood over the kitchen sink, splashing cold water on her face to steady the storm raging inside. The Polaroid lay on the counter, Grace's smile a taunt from a life she'd never known. The letter beside it, "I'm pregnant. Please come back." A plea unanswered, a wound unhealed. She grabbed a chipped mug, filling it with tap water that tasted faintly of rust, and downed it in one long gulp, her hands still trembling. Grace's words looped in her head. "I didn't want you to hate him." But hate wasn't enough to name this fire. It was betrayal, abandonment, a lifetime stolen by a man who'd kept her mom's face close but never came back. She gripped the letter, the paper crinkling in her fist, and whispered, "You son of a bitch." She snatched her keys, the metal biting into her palm, and headed for the door. Daniel Carver wasn't a shadow anymore. He was a target, and she'd hunt him down until he faced her. Emily's boots echoed on the salt-streaked pavement as she stepped off the last train into Manhattan, the city's jagged skyline piercing the midnight sky like a crown of thorns. The snow had thickened, a relentless shroud that clung to her coat and stung her cheeks, but she barely felt it. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the distant wail of sirens and the hum of late-night ambition. In her pocket, Grace's letter, crumpled, tear-stained, a 24-year-old plea, pressed against her hip alongside the Polaroid and the newspaper, a trio of weapons forged from a past she'd never known. She'd left Grace trembling in their apartment, her mom's frail warning, "You don't know what he's capable of," ringing hollow against the fire roaring in her chest. Daniel Carver wasn't just a name anymore. He was a reckoning, and she'd drag him into the light if it killed her. Carver Tech's headquarters towered ahead, a monolith of glass and steel that gleamed under the storm like a beacon of untouchable power. Emily shoved through the revolving doors, her wet boots squeaking on the polished lobby floor, the air sharp with the scent of antiseptic and wealth. A security guard, buzz-cut, broad as a linebacker, lounged behind the desk, his smirk curling as she approached. "Daniel Carver," she barked, slamming the newspaper down, his face staring up from the headline. "I need to see him. Now." The guard leaned back, crossing his arms. "Lady, it's 1 a.m. No appointments, no entry, especially not some kid off the street." "He's my father," Emily snapped, her voice a blade slicing through the sterile silence. She yanked out the Polaroid, the letter, and her birth certificate. Emily Grace Harper, father Daniel Carver, thrusting them forward like a challenge. "Tell him his daughter's here. Tell him I know he left us to rot while he built this." She jabbed a finger at the towering glass above, her hazel eyes blazing with a fury that made the guard's smirk falter. He studied the papers, his brow creasing, then grabbed the phone, muttering into it with a glance her way. After a tense minute, he jerked his head toward the elevator. "Top floor," he said, voice low, wary. "Don't make me regret this." Emily didn't thank him. She stormed past, her heart a war drum as the doors hissed shut, sealing her in a mirrored cage that reflected a girl she barely recognized. Wild hair, clenched fists, a storm ready to break. The ride up stretched into eternity, the hum of the elevator a dull roar beneath her racing thoughts. She clutched Grace's letter. "I'm pregnant. Please come back." Her mom's shaky script a lifeline to a truth she'd been denied. The doors slid open, revealing a sprawling office of glass and steel, the city glittering below like a sea of shattered promises. Daniel Carver stood behind a massive desk, his suit rumpled, a tumbler of whiskey trembling in his hand. His silver-streaked hair caught the dim light, his sharp blue eyes locking on her with a mix of exhaustion and dread. A man who'd known this moment was coming, even if he'd run from it for decades. "You," he said, his voice rough, worn thin by the night. "What do you want?" Emily didn't flinch. She crossed the room in 3 strides, her boots thudding against the hardwood, and slammed her arsenal onto his desk. The Polaroid, the letter, the birth certificate fanning out like a jury's verdict. "I'm Emily Harper," she said, her voice trembling with a rage she could no longer cage. "Grace Harper's daughter. Your daughter." Mom said you walked out when she was pregnant with me, chose your precious company over us. You're a billionaire, and she's dying in a rat-infested hole because of you. You've kept her picture in your wallet all these years. Why? What the hell are you hiding? Her words struck like fists, each one landing harder than the last, and Daniel flinched, his hand tightening around the glass until the amber liquid sloshed against the sides. He set the tumbler down with a clink, his gaze dropping to the Polaroid. Grace's smile, a relic of a life he'd torched. I didn't know she was pregnant, he said, his voice low, strained, cracking under the weight of memory. She told me she needed me, begged me to stay, but I was 25, broke, terrified. I got an offer. Silicon Valley, Carver Tech's first spark. I told her I'd come back once I had something to give her. I didn't. He picked up the letter, his fingers tracing her handwriting, his face twisting with a raw, unguarded pain. Guilt, regret, a wound festering for decades. This never reached me. I swear, Emily, I didn't know about you. Liar, Emily roared, slamming her hand on the desk, the glass rattling as her voice echoed off the glass walls. You're Daniel Carver. You could have found us. Mom's been coughing up her lungs for years, and I've been breaking my back at that diner to keep her alive. You didn't care enough to look. Tears stung her eyes, hot and furious, but she blinked them back, her voice rising to a thunderclap. You owe us. You owe her a life, and me a father who doesn't run away like a coward. Daniel sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands, his shoulders trembling as if her words had cracked something deep inside. I cared, he muttered, the words muffled, broken, slipping through his fingers like sand. I kept that picture because it was the last piece of her I had, the last time I felt whole. But I couldn't go back. I was building Carver Tech, my legacy, my proof I wasn't nothing. I thought she'd moved on, found someone else. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed, glistening with a sheen he couldn't hide. When I saw you at the diner, those eyes, Grace's eyes, I wondered, but if I claim you now, the board will tear me apart. Carver Tech's bleeding. They're waiting for a reason to bury me. Emily's laugh was sharp, bitter, cutting through the air like broken glass. Your legacy? What about ours? Mom's dying, and I'm nothing because of you. She pulled out her phone, her thumb hovering over the screen, her voice a low growl. I've got a reporter's number, one call, and this hits every headline. Billionaire CEO abandons dying ex and secret daughter. You think your board's bad now? Wait till the world sees what you really are. The threat hung like a guillotine, the air thick with its weight, a silence stretching taut between them. Father and daughter, strangers bound by a fractured past. Then the office door burst open, a wiry man in a tailored suit storming in, his face flushed with venom. He waved a tablet, his voice a snarl. Carver, what the hell's this? Security flagged her. Who is she? Daniel's jaw tightened, but before he could speak, the man's eyes narrowed on Emily, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. Wait, those eyes, Grace Harper's kid. You've got a bastard daughter stashed away? He laughed, tapping the tablet. Oh, this is gold. The board'll eat you alive. The words ignited the room like a match to gasoline. Emily lunged, her fist cocked, but Daniel surged forward, stepping between them, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Mark, shut up and get out. Mark's smirk widened, his eyes glinting with malice. Not a chance, boss. I've waited 20 years to bury you. This is my ticket. He turned to leave, but Emily grabbed his arm, yanking him back with a strength born of years hauling trays and fighting fate. You don't get to walk away, she hissed, her grip iron. Who the hell are you? Mark pulled free, his sneer baring teeth. His ex-assistant, the one who kept him on track. That's when Daniel's voice cut through, sharp and desperate, a blade unsheathed. Mark's the one who kept her from me, he said, pointing at the letter, his eyes blazing with a fury Emily hadn't seen. He intercepted Grace's calls, her letters, told me she'd left me for someone else. Then he threatened her, scared her off when she was pregnant. I found out 5 years ago, fired him, but I didn't look for her. I was too afraid of losing this. He gestured at the office, his empire, his voice breaking. I let fear win. Emily's head snapped to him, her eyes wide, the room spinning as the twist sank in. Threatened her, she whispered, her voice trembling with a new, deadly edge. You knew, and you did nothing? Mark laughed, cold and cruel, wiping a bead of sweat from his brow. She was a nobody, a seamstress dragging him down. I saved Carvertech, built it into this. You should thank me, kid. Her fist connected with his jaw before anyone could blink, a crack echoing as Mark staggered back, crashing into the desk, papers scattering like leaves in a storm. You bastard, she screamed, her voice raw, tearing from her throat like a primal howl. She ran because of you. We lost everything because of you. Blood trickled from Mark's lip, his eyes flashing with rage as he clutched his face. But Daniel grabbed her arm, pulling her back with a force that surprised her. Enough, he roared, his voice shaking the glass walls, his blue eyes wild with a mix of anger and shame. Mark, you're done. I'll ruin you for this. Get out, or I'll have security drag you. Mark straightened, his sneer faltering as he wiped the blood with his sleeve, his gaze darting between Emily's letter and Daniel's glare. You've got nothing, he spat, but his voice quavered, a crack in his bravado. He stumbled toward the door, leaving a trail of crimson droplets on the polished floor, a silent promise of retribution if he dared return. The door slammed shut, the sound reverberating like a gunshot, leaving Emily and Daniel alone in the wreckage. Emily wrenched free, her chest heaving, her hands balled into fists. Sorry doesn't fix Mom's lungs, she spat, her voice low, lethal, cutting through the silence. Sorry doesn't give me back 24 years. You want to make this right? Prove it. Now. Daniel stared at her, his breath ragged, Grace's face flashing in his mind. The woman he'd loved, the daughter he'd never known. I could take her in, he thought, give her a name, a home, everything I didn't before. But then he saw the boardroom, the vultures circling, his empire teetering on the brink. If I claim her, I lose it all. And what am I without Carvertech? What can I give them then? His hands trembled as he picked up the phone, his voice hoarse, breaking under the weight of his choice. I'll get Grace the best doctors. Hospital care, starting tomorrow. I'll send $5,000 a month, enough for you both to live. And a job. Data entry at a partner company starts next week. It's yours. He paused, his eyes meeting hers, raw and pleading. But I can't be your father, not publicly. The board would destroy me. Carvertech's all I've got left. Emily's gaze bore into him, her anger warring with exhaustion, a storm clashing with a sea too tired to rage. You're still choosing it over us, she said, her voice quiet, a blade sheathed in ice. But fine. Save Mom. Give me a chance to breathe. That's all I'll take from you. She scooped up her papers, her phone, the Polaroid, and turned to the elevator, her boots echoing in the vast empty space. As the doors closed, she leaned against the wall, tears spilling over at last. Not for him, but for Grace, for the life they'd clawed back. She'd won something. Not a father, but survival. It would have to be enough. The elevator doors slid shut with a soft ding, sealing Emily away from Daniel Carver's glass-walled kingdom and the battlefield of their confrontation. She slumped against the cold steel, her breath hitching as tears broke free, carving hot trails down her cheeks. Not for the man she'd left behind, but for Grace, for the years they'd lost, for the fragile victory she'd clawed from his cowardice. Her hands gripped the Polaroid, Grace's letter, and her phone, the relics of a past she'd forced him to face, their edges digging into her palms like shards of a broken promise. The descent felt endless, each floor a ghost of her life. Grace's labored gasp echoing through their crumbling apartment, the greasy haze of Dee's diner, the bills that had chained her to a grind she'd never chosen. She'd won something, doctors for her mom, money to live, a job to rise. But Daniel's words lingered like a bruise. I can't be your father, not publicly. She wiped her face with her sleeve, her jaw tightening as the doors opened to the lobby. I don't need you, she muttered, stepping into the frigid Manhattan night. the snow swirling around her like ashes of a fire long burned out. The train back to Queens rattled through the dark, its grimy windows reflecting a girl forged in steel, battered but unbroken. Emily's coat was still dusted with snow, her boots leaving faint smears on the floor as she replayed the night. Mark's sneering confession, Daniel's shattered excuses, the promises she'd wrung from him with a fist and a threat. She pressed her forehead against the glass, the cold seeping into her skin, and thought of Grace, frail, fading, but not lost. Not anymore. The $5,000 a month, the doctors, the job. They weren't a father's love, but they were a lifeline, a crack of light in a darkness she'd fought alone for too long. She clutched the Polaroid, Grace's smile a beacon through the storm, and whispered, "We'll make it, Mom, with or without him." Spring crept into Queens by May 2026, a tentative thaw that melted the snow into muddy rivulets and coaxed faint green from the cracked sidewalks. Daniel kept his word. Within 48 hours of their clash, a team of specialists descended on their apartment, their white coats and gentle voices a stark contrast to the chaos Emily knew. They whisked Grace to a private hospital upstate, a sanctuary of gleaming tiles, soft blankets, and machines that purred instead of wheezed. The oxygen tank was swapped for a sleek device that hummed with quiet efficiency, and week by week, Grace's breath grew deeper, her ashen pallor warming into a faint flush of life. Emily sat by her bedside after shifts at her new job. Data entry at a tech firm downtown, tedious but steady, her apron traded for a second-hand blazer and flats that didn't pinch. She rented a one-bedroom apartment with her first paycheck, its walls free of mold, its heat a reliable whisper, and stocked the fridge with fresh food. No more dented cans or stale bread. One afternoon, Emily walked into Grace's room, the sunlight spilling through the window to paint her mom's gray hair with a soft glow. Grace sat up, a mug of chamomile tea steaming in her hands, her smile wide and unguarded. The first real smile Emily had seen in years. "You look good, Mom," she said, her voice catching as she sank into the chair beside her, the familiar ache in her chest softening into something warm. Grace reached out, her hand steady against Emily's cheek, her touch a lifeline. "Because of you, sweetie," she said, her voice soft but strong, free of the rasp that had haunted it. "You fought for me when I couldn't. I'm so proud." Emily swallowed hard, tears prickling her eyes as she squeezed her mom's hand. "You're all I've got," she replied, her words a vow etched into the quiet. The first $5,000 check arrived that week, slipped under the door in a plain envelope by a courier who vanished as quickly as he came. Emily stared at it on the kitchen counter, the paper cool against her fingertips. Daniel's guilt in tangible form, a penance she'd forced from him. Part of her wanted to tear it apart, to fling it back with a note that read, "Keep your blood money." But Grace's steady breaths, the hospital bills dissolving like smoke, and the nights she no longer woke to her mom's gas held her back. She cashed it, paid the rent, bought groceries, real butter, fresh apples, things she'd once dreamed of, and felt the weight on her shoulders lift, a fragile freedom she hadn't dared imagine. Across the city, Daniel Carver stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, the Manhattan skyline sprawling beneath him like a kingdom he'd conquered at a cost too high to name. The boardroom wars had quieted. Mark's disgrace, cemented by Grace's letter in Emily's hands, had silenced the vultures for now, but the victory rang hollow. His desk drowned in reports, his phone buzzed with demands, yet his gaze drifted to the wallet beside him, the Polaroid peeking out like a silent reprimand. He'd kept his promises. Grace was in care. Emily had a job. The checks flowed monthly. But every night, alone in his penthouse, he saw Grace's laughter in the shadows, Emily's fierce eyes cutting through the dark. "It's not enough," he muttered, his voice rough with whiskey and a dawning truth. Carver Tech, his legacy, his shield, had become a cage, its walls closing in with every breath he took alone. He flipped open the wallet, Grace's smile staring back, a memory of a time when he'd been more than a name on a building. "I could have found her," he thought, his chest tightening. "When I learned Mark threatened her, I had the means. Detectives, hospitals. I chose this instead." But now the empire felt like ash, its weight a chain he couldn't bear. He stood, his hands trembling as he grabbed his coat, a decision igniting within him. Fragile, reckless, but undeniable. "I need to see her," he said to the empty room, the words a lifeline he couldn't let slip away. That evening, Daniel stood outside Grace's hospital room, the sterile hallway silent save for the thud of his heart against his ribs. He adjusted his tie, a nervous tick from a life of control, and knocked. A soft, hesitant sound that belied the storm inside. Grace looked up from her bed, a book tumbling from her hands, her hazel eyes widening in a shock that stole her breath. "Daniel?" she whispered, her voice trembling, her face paling as if a ghost had stepped through the door. He closed it behind him, his throat tight, his steps faltering as he crossed the room. "Grace," he said, his voice cracking, raw with years of unspoken regret. "I was wrong, so wrong. I didn't know about Emily, about Mark's threats. Not at first. When I found out 5 years ago, I still ran. I chose Carver Tech over you, over her, every damn time. I'm tired of running. I want to connect again. With you, with Emily, if you'll let me. Not publicly, not yet. Just step by step. I don't deserve it, but I'm asking." Grace stared, tears spilling down her cheeks, her hands clutching the blanket as the past surged up to meet her. "You left us," she said, her voice raw, breaking on every word. "I waited, Daniel. I wrote. I called. I begged. Then that man threatened me, and I ran to keep her safe. Why now?" He sank into a chair beside her, his head bowing, his hands clasped as if in prayer. "Because I can't live with the silence anymore," he said, his voice thick with tears he couldn't shed. "Seeing Emily, knowing you're alive, it's killing me to stay away. I don't expect forgiveness, Grace. Just a chance, a thread to hold on to." She wiped her eyes, her breath shaky, her gaze searching his face. "I need time," she said finally, her voice soft but firm. "And Emily, she's not me. She won't let you in easy." Daniel nodded, a faint, broken smile tugging at his lips. "I'll wait," he said, "as long as it takes." The next day, Emily wheeled Grace outside, the May sun warming her mom's face as kids chased pigeons across the hospital lawn. Their laughter a melody Grace echoed, soft, clear, alive. Back home, Emily found the latest $5,000 envelope on the table. Daniel's silent offering. She held it, her chest tight. Grace was safe, their life steady. But memories of the past, Grace's gasps, neighbors lost to illness, faces at D's faded by poverty, pushed her forward. She drove to a Queens charity office, a cramped nook buzzing with volunteers who knew her from scraps she'd spared before. A woman with tired eyes took the envelope, peering inside, then gasped, her glasses slipping. $5,000, she said, her voice cracking. Emily nodded, tears welling as she spoke. "My mom was like them. Sick, broke, no help. The phlegm in her lungs nearly killed her. But she's okay now. Use this for people like she was. Give them a chance." The woman hugged her, sobbing, her arms trembling. "You're an angel. This could save someone." Emily's throat tightened, a weight lifting as she whispered, "I hope so." She walked out, the sun warm on her face, a quiet strength settling in her bones. That night, Grace sat her down at their small kitchen table, her eyes hesitant, the lilies Daniel had left perfuming the air. Her favorite, a detail he'd remembered. "Daniel came yesterday," she said, her voice soft. "He wants to connect again. With us." Emily's stomach dropped, her hands clenching as she stormed outside, finding Daniel by his car, his face etched with a nervous hope. "You think seeing Mom fixes this?" she snapped, her voice cold, cutting. He met her gaze, steady but raw. "No," he said, his tone low, earnest. "I know it doesn't. I left you both. I was a coward. I want to know you, Emily, and Grace, if you'll let me. No demands, no titles. Just a start. I'll wait for your say." Emily's eyes burned, her voice ice. "I don't need a dad. Never did. Mom decides what she wants, and I'll respect it. Don't expect me to run to you." Daniel nodded, a faint smile breaking through the weight in his eyes. Fair enough, he said, setting the lilies on the step. I'll be here. He climbed into his car, the engine humming as he drove off, leaving the flowers behind, a quiet promise in the dusk. Inside, Emily sat with Grace, the lilies' scent weaving through the room. Grace touched her hand, her voice a whisper. I don't know yet, sweetie, she said, her eyes glistening. But maybe there's room. Emily didn't reply, her gaze drifting to her laptop. A coding tutorial glowing on the screen, a future she'd built herself. She'd fought, she'd won, she'd given back, and now a door stood ajar, its hinges creaking with possibility. She didn't step through, not yet, but she didn't close it either.